This lecture will cover late medieval art in both France and England. We must remember as well that at this time the families were interrelated and ruled one another's territories. Therefore, there's a great deal of overlap and competition between them. The division of the Gothic periods are as follows: early, high, and late. The early Gothic will begin with Saint Denis being built and the expansion of the use of rib vaulting that allows for these structures to get ever taller. The High Gothic begins with the rebuilding of Chartres that we will look at next in 1194. And then finally, the late Gothic is going to begin with the dedication by Louis IX of Chartres in 1260. So therefore, the building of the Chartres Cathedral is going to be one of the most important milestones for this type of art. Now, the Parisian style that is going to be popularized by the monarchs is seen most clearly in Paris, in perhaps one of the most iconic Gothic structures built for Saint Louis. Here, Louis IX, or Saint Louis, the namesake for Saint Louis, will oversee the golden age of the French monarchy and be responsible for many architectural features himself. What we find here is a further sophistication from what we looked at last time at Chartres, Amiens, and Reims. Perhaps one of the most famous of these architectural commissions is Sainte-Chapelle, which can be understood as the culmination of Gothic art that had begun with Saint-Denis itself. Louis IX had in fact commissioned this Sainte-Chapelle, or this holy chapel, to hold the relics of Christ's Passion brought back from the Holy Land, including the crown of thorns, the piece of the true cross, and more. Interestingly, this is the final phase of the Gothic in France, known as the Rayonnant style or the courtly style, the most flamboyant and decorative of them here in this country. Now, the shrine itself looks like and functions as a reliquary because, in fact, that's what the structure is designed to do, to hold these relics brought back from the Holy Land associated with Christ's crucifixion. The upper and lower liturgical spaces are divided much like St. Francis at Assisi, built around the same time. Here we have the upper section of this chapel completely surrounded by stained glass, the culmination of what was attempted since the early Gothic. The subjects in the stained glass are going to be that of the exploits of kings and queens from the Old Testament, whom Louis had claimed to be his royal ancestors, appropriate for this royal private chapel. Here, from the exterior, one can see the external buttressing that is in fact hidden from the viewer inside, where the walls completely displace any of the indication that there were these support mechanisms. Here we have another view which shows the buttressing is going to be placed so closely to the edge of the structure that in fact the light will obscure it from the interior. The interior walls, in fact, are reduced to slender piers and mullions, where the skeletal support for this vast skin of stained glass is going to fully realize the advancements begun at Saint-Denis, in which we now have a hemicycle, or a semicircular interior space, one continuous open area for the king and his entourage to worship privately his own collections of relics associated directly with the death and passion of Christ. Much like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, we see these bronze stars decorating the quadripartite rib vaulting that we can see is the culmination that is much taller, much more delicate and graceful and decorative from the early humble beginnings of the squat Saint-Denis ribs. In fact, we can see how we arrived at this very specific royal solution, as it derives or draws from plans earlier from Reims and others that had a coronational association and a much more streamlined torpedo-like design, where the transept now completely dissolves and is folded into the nave. Looking at the interior today with the electric lighting, we get a vague sense of what it originally would have appeared as, with candles, golden and glimmering, as light passes through the exterior, giving us a complete 360-degree skin of stained glass that is only going to be temporarily and intermittently interrupted with these small pier clusters that are also decoratively painted brightly like the stained glass itself. The stained glass, as mentioned, is going to illustrate exploits of Old Testament kings and queens, the ancestors Louis IX claimed for his own. This traditional representation off to the right of a crowd as overlapping masses of identical figures carry on the medieval tradition, as we have alternating colors for these horses. However, the two soldiers at the far left, much like that of St. Theodore, are going to be sharply foreshortened as these horses project into the viewer's space, breaking with that medieval tradition, showing us two directionalities and an anecdotal approach, thus carrying out in stained glass the same thing that we saw in sculpture with the Virgin of Jean d'Evreux and the Visitation. Now, the interest in showing foreshortening goes back to antiquity, but certainly is going to indicate that the artists are considering the viewing angle of the spectator, and this notion that the flat surface is not going to be in fact flat, but instead could be a visual projection onto another world. In between these stained glass marvels, we also have a series of piers and statues of the 12 apostles on very low consoles. Now, only 3 of them survive, each within a gracefully poised position, with voluminous drapery falling into triangular pockets that cascade rhythmically down them, much like other international Gothic-style drapery. The triangular faces, small pinched eyes, and tiny mouths, along with the curly mustaches, are a further refinement of the courtiers that would be seen here in attendance at Sainte-Chapelle for these royal gatherings. Here we can see the face with the part down the center and the highly manicured beard that would be seen here along with these processions. It is no wonder then that Sainte-Chapelle would become the model for the Rayonnant or the courtly style, the last in the evolution of the Gothic, the style born in France and, of course, spreading elsewhere throughout Europe. Now, this was credited to the Parisian builder Perrier de Montreux, who also was going to remodel Notre Dame in 1225 as well. Now, Notre Dame is at the very center of the city and functions as the cathedral for Paris itself. So it is a very beloved church, even more so now after the fire gutted the interior in 2019. So we often see these novels and others describing the view from Notre Dame as though you can see the entire city. Prior to the raising of the Eiffel Tower, this would have been the central point for overseeing and looking the city. So with Paris's cathedral, here we have the clear story drop down to absorb these larger windows. Montreux finished the south transept, as can be seen here, and then the others were finished quite later, such as the crossing spire in the 19th century. Here, the interior space is the tripartite division that we have seen ever since Saint-Étienne at Caen, with the lower nave, the triforium, and the clear story above. If we look at the plan for the cathedrals, one can see that the transept becomes increasingly tucked into the nave itself until we get an almost bullet or torpedo-like design. Therefore, as in high Gothic cathedrals, these late Gothic structures almost entirely absorb the transept. If we compare the evolution from Reims to Notre Dame all the way through Sainte-Chapelle, one can see this continual evolution and this new type of style that appreciates the one solid structure to the walls. Thus, you can have entire skinned sections of stained glass. The exterior next to the River Seine can also be seen with the external flying buttressing, the massive rose windows off to the side, and how the transept is folding into the nave proper. The massive rose window also carries on this late Gothic tradition, as we discussed in Sainte-Chapelle, with massive radiating spires here. The tracery here appears to be even more shrine-like than before at Sainte-Chapelle, and is also much, much larger, encompassing a very wide space, thus giving the interior the appearance of an entire wall covered in colored glass. The exterior, like other late Gothic structures, is going to conceal the structure by way of these flying buttresses and spires. As part of the article this week, we will read about how we can understand this obsession with moving towards obfuscating or masking the structure proper in exchange for this new aesthetic. So the buttresses actually rise into these glazing traphoria. Therefore, we have this freestanding notion of elements that break these horizontal divisions of the facade. And as mentioned, they're going to mask the structure itself. So you can't see that it's one solid bullet-shaped structure with a transept folded in, but instead it dissolves into light airiness. This developed from the sculptural decorations that we talked about at Reims and other cathedrals in the high Gothic era, to where the walls of the structure begin turning into sculpture and eventually dissolve into this latticework design. The Rayonnant or courtly style, as discussed at Sainte-Chapelle, also holds many elaborate sculptural works that are meant to conceal the structural elements themselves. On the interior, for instance, in the hemicycle of the facade, we notice that you cannot really tell where the buttressing is. Instead, it looks like a solid area of stained glass. And this is the effect that the builders and the designers were hoping for. With the explosion in church building in the Gothic era, it is not surprising that Paris would come to dominate the architectural scene and also spread this new style throughout Europe. Additionally, Paris would come to dominate also the illuminated manuscript production in the region and would spread to other areas, influencing them, being adopted in a regional variation. So now we find that urban areas are going to be dictating this courtly style, no longer the rural monasteries. So we have a different type of style evolving, one that is going to follow the precepts and the lead of the monarchy. For instance, the Bible Moralise, or Moralizing Bible, as an illuminated manuscript, is an example of this aristocratic patronage, whereby we see the Queen Blanche of Castile and her son Louis IX enthroned in the top section, surrounded by the city, whereas below we see the monks that are going to be working diligently to illuminate the very manuscript we're looking at, one on the left with a clerical tonsure. So here we find that one is dictating the text to be copied and then illuminated by the scribe. The image, you'll notice, is going to be very similar to those seen in stained glass examples, such as Chartres that we talked about, where also we find Blanche of Castile was a great royal patron of the arts. So this notion of the Queen of France becomes allied with the Queen of Heaven. Both of them, of course, are going to be shown almost identically, wearing a crown, decorated by fleur-de-lis, and wearing blue. So these moralizing Bibles are going to become quite popular in the era as an instruction manual. They are encyclopedic picture books showing Old Testament and New Testament typologies, or how Old Testament stories are going to be seen in New Testament stories, such as the sacrifice of Isaac prefiguring the crucifixion of Christ. The text off to the side are going to be short moralizing commentaries of how to understand these Old Testament and New Testament stories. These very often are organized into 2 columns of 8 medallions each. The structure and the format, in fact, is going to be inspired by the lancet windows, such as at Sainte-Chapelle that we discussed, which also has Old Testament scenes, such as, once again, the army crossing the river, and New Testament scenes, such as the book of Revelations above. We also find that other illuminated manuscripts are going to copy Sainte-Chapelle, such as the Psalter of Saint Louis. Here, in the Feast of Abraham, we see a direct reference to Sainte-Chapelle in the background, as a matter of fact. The story in the foreground is familiar and has been illustrated in mosaics elsewhere, going back to the 7th century. Here with the Feast of Abraham, you have the angels coming and sharing a feast with the elderly Abraham and his wife before they announce that he will have a son, Isaac. They are seen revealing as such on the left-hand side in a continuous narrative after feasting on the right-hand side as Abraham serves them. In the background, divided by a tree, you'll notice we have the same structure as Sainte-Chapelle. The stained glass windows and the pinnacles and the rose windows of such cathedrals are going to be similar decorative elements found in illuminated manuscripts. The flat and silhouetted figures, much like a cloisonné technique that we've discussed earlier, shows the influence of the refined qualities of the courtly style, much like the sculptures inside Sainte-Chapelle proper, who are elongated and emphasize this rhythmic drapery that sweeps back and forth, while the hair also is modeled after that of courtiers. As the century progressed in the 1200s, the demand for books grew among the courts and university circles because every student needed a text for quick reference. Therefore, ateliers are going to spring up around these universities, especially in Paris. So the librarius, which is the equivalent of a master mason for architecture, would be the individual who oversaw these projects, whereas scribes under his direction would copy and then illuminate each one of these illuminated manuscripts. Now, because there were so many workshops producing illuminated manuscripts, it was important for them to differentiate themselves from others. Therefore, artists would emerge in these workshops to bring more prestige to them. Therefore, they would receive more commissions if someone of great esteem was working in the atelier or the workshop. These include the Master Honoré and Jean Pucelle. Now, this is going to be dominant as far as the style is concerned with this international Gothic style or courtly style, whereby again the figures will have clear contours and outlines like an enameled cloisonné and are elongated and rhythmic. A type of illuminated manuscript that was very popular among the aristocracy at this time would be books of hours, a very wealthy luxury item that only kings, queens, and the wealthiest among society could afford. Now, they were a private prayer book that illustrated the 8 canonical devotional hours of the day, and were often carried like a clutch or a purse as a woman would, like jewelry. So these pocket books were also carried like university students, for instance. Now, the different prayers one would say in the 8 different hours are going to be finalized supposedly by Benedict of Nursia, though different versions existed in early Christianity prior, and they move through the different parts of the day, from, of course, the night until the next night, all the way from Matin all the way down to Compline. Perhaps one of the most famous would be Vespers, especially in art, as we will see with Vesper builds in Germany, the evening prayer. As we move through, they very often illustrate episodes of the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary from the beginning, such as their birth, until their death in the evening or night. At this time, we find Charles IV, who's going to be commissioning a very wealthy luxury item in the sumptuary arts for his 14-year-old queen, Jeanne d'Evreux.
So the notion of marrying at 13 or 14 was actually quite common at the time upon the onset of menses. This, of course, ensured that there were no issues or arguments for the right of succession had the queen been engaged in relationships prior to her marriage. Now, the imagery that we find in the Book of Hours, which is a manuscript illumination for Jeanne d'Evreux, clearly states that her primary goal is to produce a in the example shown here, Jean Pucelle, who is the most accomplished manuscript illuminator in France, is going to decorate each page with an image of the life of Christ, paralleling that of the life of the Virgin. Now, this type of typology, paralleling one story with the other, that of the Virgin Mary and her son, is very common. We saw this with Giotto Scribani Chapel, for instance. Now, the particular moments chosen to parallel are also significant and generally are going to fall in line with the narrative or arc of their lives from birth until death, or from beginning until end. So as we have here, the betrayal of Judas, or the kiss of Judas on the left-hand side, where we find Judas is leaning in to identify Christ to be arrested by the Romans. You find Peter is still cutting off the ear of the servant right directly below him, is going to be paralleled with that of the Annunciation, where you find the Archangel Gabriel is going to be kneeling in front of the Virgin Mary, telling her that she will give birth to the Son of God, while a section of the ceiling opens up, allowing the dove of the Holy Spirit to descend on her and impregnate her. Now, each one of these scenes is going to relate to the beginning of something. The betrayal of Judas relates to the beginning of Christ's passion, whereas the Annunciation scene is the beginning of Christ's incarnation, when he becomes flesh. Now, the body of Christ and that of the Virgin Mary are likewise in a parallel fashion facing one another and are S-shaped. The Virgin Mary is a backwards S to complement that of Christ. This elegant, elongated style reflects that of the courtly style we discussed earlier, each one here painted in grisaille or shades of gray instead of being entirely in color, which would be incredibly expensive. Now, the small, doll-like architecture, right, and the elegance of the figures means that Pucelle certainly would have traveled to Siena to look at the art of Duccio that we talked about, who had decorated the Maestà, and similarly attempted to set within the small architectural features these elongated, very elegant forms. Jeanne d'Evreux also, along with having Jean Pucelle decorate a Book of Hours for her, also patronized a wonderful reliquary for herself that she dedicated and gave to the Church of Saint-Denis, the burial place for the French monarchs. Now, in the International Gothic style, we have a very characteristic, elegant, elongated figure here of the Virgin Mary, holding a fleur-de-lis in her right hand, which of course is the lily flower, with the Christ child, right? Here we have the lily flower encrusted with pearls and semi-precious stones, whereas the Christ child is going to be gently touching her face with his right hand, holding an apple in his left. Now, the fleur-de-lis is the symbol of the French monarchy, going all the way back to the Merovingians and then adopted again by Charlemagne in his imagery. Now, this is a reliquary, which means that it holds a relic, which is going to be an object associated with a holy person. It can either be part of their body or something they touched, such as the crown of thorns or the shroud of Turin or Veronica's veil are all going to be relics of Christ because they touched him at the crucifixion and during the Passion. In this case, we find a strand of Mary's hair is actually going to be inside of this section of the reliquary. Now, you find that Christ is going to be holding an apple, and even though it does not explicitly state that the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was an apple, the fruit here directly connects Christ as the new Adam, and thus the Virgin as the new Eve. Since Adam and Eve caused the downfall of mankind, it is thus appropriate and apropos that the Virgin and Christ will redeem mankind. This is the type of typology that we find that is very common in the Christian tradition, including that of the Old Testament prophets below that are going to be flanking scenes from the Passion itself. Thus we have a type of paralleling here of the Old Testament that foretells the New Testament. And very common that you've already seen with Cimabue's Madonna and Child Enthroned with prophets and angels. All right, so at the same time, we have the prophets, right, foretelling and supporting the Virgin Mary in the coming of Christ as the King later on in the generations. Now, this style that can be seen here with the Virgin of Jean d'Evreux is a textbook International Gothic, in that we have a swaying S-shaped pose, a very exaggerated pose with all of the weight placed on one leg. In this case, she's shifting all of her weight to the left, thus relaxing the right leg and the hips moving in the opposite direction, giving you that characteristic elegant, sensuous S shape. The drapery as well is going to be pulled back and forth across the figure, thus rhythmically acting as a rhythmic device, showing you that the figure is, as at court, appropriately elegant. So the International Gothic style, if we were to consider the characteristics, are as follows. You will have these elongated proportions, slightly attenuated, we would say. We have very heavy drapery that does not act as though gravity is pulling or drawing it downward, but instead sweeping and swaying side to side as though it were alive and a character of its own. And then finally, serpentine rhythmic lines and motions that move us back and forth across the figure, that sways from one direction to the next. A very appropriately elegant and kingly.
Jean Poussel's student, Jean Lenoir, or John of the Night, is also going to create in this type of style, but heavily influenced by historical events of the day. Here we have the so-called the Three Living and the Three Dead from the prayer book of Bon of Luxembourg. Here we can see the same type of elongated rhythmic S shape in the decoration and the comportment of the figures. Here, three young men unaware that death is coming for them. In order of least to most decayed, we have left to right a series of corpses. Now, this prayer book, not surprisingly, was commissioned months after Bon's husband had died. In fact, it serves as a memento mori, a reminder of mortality, as we all will die, just as her husband had in the Black Death, the plague. Therefore, we confront the corpses in various stages of decay, showing us what our future will bring. So here we find that the very first of the young men to witness this, to what will happen to him, turns away, seen here to the far right. The second one covers his nose to minimize the stench of the rotting corpses, whereas the third has a falcon on his arms and points towards death, unafraid of it. So we reinforce here the art of dying well, or the ars moriendi, where you prepare for your final judgment, which is very applicable due to the plague in the 1340s. Now, the ars moriendi have a very resonant popularity at this time, in that they will show people about to die and how you should and should not behave to prepare oneself for death and to meet your maker. You should pray and be very pious and quiet, instead of trying to take money with you, kicking people and fighting it. Now, the Black Death famously swept across Europe from the east in 1348. Remember, the Duchess who had commissioned this herself dies in the same year of 1348.
Of the population, and at least in many cities, a third of the population of all of Europe have died. This, of course, we do not have exact numbers for because those individuals charged with census data also perished. So it's widespread epidemiological disaster. Of course, they did not know that the Black Death was spread by fleas who hitched a ride on the back of rats, carrying, again, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which, of course, caused the slow deterioration of the systems in the body, which shut down periodically. You find that there would be a putrid stench that would emanate from the figures as their body slowly rotted. So plague doctors would often wear what would be the equivalent, as we would understand today, as gas masks with the CDC. Thus, they would wear bird beaks so they would not get sick from the stench of these victims. So it is called the bubonic plague, however, because of the buboes that will form. These are going to be large protrusions around the lymph nodes of the neck, the groin, and the armpit. So they very often would lance these very painful protrusions with the liquids coming out of them. You can see in the top left the lancing of a woman's neck, whereas the armpit is ready to be lanced and the liquid seeping out to the left here. It's called the Black Death because of gangrene that sets in, this necrotizing effect, this necrosis, whereby dead blood will pool right to the surface, thus your skin turns black.
Now, leading up to the Black Death, we have a further refinement in sculpture, in this instance for Sainte-Chapelle itself. Here we have the Virgin and Child, or La Vierge de la Sainte-Chapelle, of 16 inches high around the year 1300. Now, in this instance, we have these elegant draperies that sway gently. Here we find that Christ reaches for an apple, showing that he is the new Adam. He will redeem mankind. And Eve is the new, or the Virgin Mary is the new Eve, who will redeem mankind as well. So you have the new Adam and the new Eve here. The drapery and the proportions are going to be similar to those seen in the Apostles, decorating Sainte-Chapelle. We also can find the swaying as the Virgin moves back, creating this S shape, as she traditionally supports the Christ child with her left hand, thus, of course, giving us that wonderful, elegant S-shaped curve.
Nearly a decade later, and reinforcing the association of the French monarchy with the King and Queen of Heaven, we have a donation by the King of France to Saint-Denis, the burial place for French monarchs and the birthplace of the Gothic itself. In 1339, we see this developed further in a reliquary. The Virgin of Jean d'Evreux, as it is so known because the Queen of France, Jean d'Evreux, commissioned it. We have a figure that is just over 2 feet tall that held the Virgin Mary's hair. Now, the international Gothic style that we saw developing at Reims can be seen here and spreading throughout all of Europe, with these elongated proportions, this rather heavy drapery, and a serpentine-like sweeping motion that draws the eye rhythmically back and forth across the figure as she holds the fleur-de-lis in her right hand, or the lily, the flower of France and of the monarchy, and supports the Christ child with her left hand, as he then gently caresses her cheek and holds the apple with his left hand, showing that he is the new Adam. Now, the figures that can be seen here and the proportions become fairly codified, where the Virgin will rest her weight on her left leg, swaying her body or the upper portion of her shoulders to the right, and finding her head then twisting back in the opposite direction towards the engaged leg to the left. This gives us a very pronounced S-shaped and very elegant motion to follow back and forth. The classical contrapposto, which is the origin for the swaying motion in the Virgin of Jean d'Evreux is taken to a much greater graceful extreme, where instead of gently placing all of the weight on one leg and counterbalancing the upper portion of the body, now the Virgin is going to place all of the weight on the left leg, swaying dramatically to her right, while her head then alternatively moves back to the left, giving us this dramatic S-shaped pose. The twisting contrapposto seen here then is effectively gracefully exaggerated in a courtly fashion, which is appreciated at the time for this courtly audience, thus still connecting in this commission the Queen of France with the Queen of Heaven. England at the same time, which of course controlled much of the United Kingdom that we know today, sans Western Ireland and Scotland, and is also going to control southern Italy and Sicily, is going to prosper at this time, given that most of the wars fought in the 100 Years' War, these battles, occurred on the northern coast of France, and thus spared England and its inhabitants the suffering that this caused. It's at this time that we have Chaucer writing the Canterbury Tales on secular stories that come out of and after the Black Death. We also are going to find at this time that the rise of the individual, an interest in humanism in Italy with poets such as Dante and Petrarch, these historians that are reviving and trying to translate ancient Greco-Roman manuscripts and literature themselves. At the same time, we have the rise of secular art and an interest in secularism that we also can see in England. In works such as the small ivory chest with scenes of courtly romances, produced between 1330 and 1350, we have an example of a luxury object or sumptuary art that would be given to a woman to hold her jewelry. It's also going to often be used as a courtship or a wedding gift, something you would give to a woman as part of the courtship ritual of trying to woo her and or as a gift on her wedding. So the scenes, appropriately, are not religious. They are secular and often are going to relate scenes of love in allegorical or metaphorical themes. So here we have on the top of this jewelry box the attack on the Castle of Love. So the attack on the Castle of Love will have episodes that people would be familiar with at the time, such as jousting tournaments and battles, besieging cities, etc. In the center, we have two knights who are charging at one another with their lances outstretched, as, of course, women above look on and point and consider the bravery of these men. Now, the act of jousting is, of course, a metaphor for courtship itself, which we can see to the right, in which a woman is mock jousting with a knight, as each holds a rose and then an oak bough. Now, symbolism of these objects will reveal that they are sexual surrender and fertility. Thus, of course, the game of charging at one another, as almost as though we're playing a game of chicken, seeing who will flinch, is to have the outcome of fertility, to get married, to have children. So we have that symbolism here. In the rose, always a symbol of love and courtship, and the oak bough, oaks and acorns, of course, relating to the male seed and fertility. On the left-hand side, we have a series of knights that are besieging a city, where at the top we find Cupid with an oversized, comically oversized, bow and arrow firing back, and others defending the territory. Now remember that a woman's chastity and her virtue are seen as a castle wall, which men must besiege and conquer and break down. Thus you see them climbing up the wall, trying to get over it, just as you would then conquer a woman's virtue and then courtship would be consummated at that time. This can also be seen as far as scenes of love and courtship and the power that women hold over men in the side where we find the follies of Aristotle, the great philosopher, pupil of Plato, and mentor and teacher of Alexander the Great. So we find here again Alexander the Great mentoring, right, great pupils like, find Aristotle mentoring great pupils like Alexander the Great, showing us what a great thinker he was. Yet even this amazing thinker, philosopher, and founder of the Aristotelian and Peripatetic tradition cannot overcome his desire for Campase, which is going to be the mistress of Alexander the Great. So he is so smitten by this woman that he is going to demean himself by acting like an animal, playing horseyback with her, letting her ride him like an animal in this instance, with, of course, a bridle in his mouth. All right, so this is meant to represent the folly of the pagan philosopher, but also how women have power over their suitors, an appropriate subject given that the beauty of a woman, which is going to be emphasized by the jewelry that she wears, would be kept within this object.
In this 12th century French love poem, we find that the knight Tristan will fall in love with Isolde and dupe her husband, or future husband, King Mark. Now, this very much influenced the Arthurian romance of Lancelot and Guinevere, for Tristan is to bring the princess to his uncle to be married. And thus, once again, we find they ingest the love potion en route. So we have this illicit rendezvous or love affair that's happening.
Now, on the end, we have another very interesting image that relates to the virtue and power of women, that of Tristan and Isolde, and that of a unicorn. So off to the left, you can see the duped king whose soon-to-be wife is actually cheating on him, falling in love with Tristan here. It's a very famous story that leads to the Arthurian legend of Arthur and Guinevere. But off to the right, aside from this cuckolded husband, you're going to see a man who is stabbing a unicorn that sits in a woman's lap, more specifically a virgin's lap that you have here. The long, oversized horn can be seen sprouting out of its brow. Now, you find that virgins are going to be associated with unicorns in imagery, especially in the north, in tapestries, paintings, and engravings like what we see here, these relief carvings, because it was understood that virgins and chastity were as rare as a unicorn, and thus they're the only ones that can get close to, given their purity, a unicorn. Now, imagery can be found throughout the Marginalia of illuminated manuscripts and the art at this time, whereby the unicorn always sits in the virgin's lap and is penetrated by a knight who comes in with a spear. Right? The unicorn has a phallic object coming out of its head, and the knight is also going to have a phallic object to conquer it. Right, so it is, of course, very obvious that the man is going to be killing the woman's virginity. Thus, of course, her purity, which is the unicorn, symbolized as such, is killed.
Turning to the purely secular, here we have lovers playing chess, carved in ivory of 1300. Now, while it does not illustrate a poem or a legend, it does fall within the same type of secular decoration that we've been discussing, and illustrates a very popular pastime and a metaphor that we see for courtship at the time. Now, chess had been brought to Europe from Islamic regions around the year 1000. Now, we find here that chess is often understood to be a contest of courtly love, whereby men and women would play against one another just as you would court one another, and eventually, once again, surrender in the same way to the power that women have over men during this courtly love relationship. So here we have several examples of men and women playing chess. In each one of them, we note that the man is going to grasp the pole, supposedly holding up the drapery under which they are going to be seated to play the game, whereas the woman's dress is going to be creased in such a way as she, of course, is going to point to the chessboard, desiring this idea to continue. The fold, of course, is created by her drapery relating to female genitalia, is quite obvious. We find here that he has captured her piece, thus the man grasps the central pole, checking his mate. So we have this notion of defeating one another in chess as a metaphor for courtship, and once again acquiescing to one another's sexual interests. Turning now to England, we see what happens in this area that is certainly related to the French family, but wishes to differentiate themselves from them artistically and architecturally. So remember, England will appropriate this French Gothic style we've been discussing, but will keep certain local traditions that we will discuss here shortly because of the political tensions between the two during the 100 Years' War. So here we find that London will grow into a very large city, but unlike in France, we find most people are still going to live in rural villages and market towns. So we don't have the equivalent of Paris in England at the time. What we do have is the Plantagenet Dynasty, which lasted from 1198 to 1340. Originally founded by Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, as we discussed, we have this English and French dynasties related coming together, but also feuding with one another, disagreeing on who should take over when someone dies and or is married. Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart as he becomes known, is going to fight in the Third Crusade. He was the younger brother of John, the villain from Robin Hood, as people know him, and he took England. Thus, of course, we find that he will regain his kingdom, but at his death, still the kingdom goes to John the Soft Sword. John's rule at this time was disastrous. He lost Normandy to Philip II of France. He signed the Magna Carta, or the Major Charter, as everyone knows, limiting the power of the king in 1215. This leads to the founding of Parliament that we know of today in England, that must approve the king's decisions. Thus, in 1337, we begin the 100 Years' War, where the English Edward III will claim the French throne. Parliament is divided into two houses at this time between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And finally, in 1348, the Black Death kills half of England, and at the same time, Chaucer will write the Canterbury Tales. The French Gothic is going to find its way to England, becoming influential in both architecture and manuscript illumination. But, as with every other country, it will be tempered by local materials, preferences, and methods that are so ingrained in the cultural consciousness that they cannot be abandoned outright. This, we find, will adopt in the Gothic in England from the French a continued interest in using expressive line to enliven surface decoration. That is what the English hold on to when they adopt these new principles from the French. In discussing the phases of the English Gothic, we find that it follows a similar trajectory to that of the French. We begin with the Lancet Gothic from 1200 to 1250, named as such for the lancet windows, or these bullet-shaped windows you see here. The second phase is known as the Decorated Gothic from 1250 to 1350, beginning first with the geometric style, whereby we have decorative tracery and geometric shapes, giving way to the curvilinear, which has flamboyant lines and intertwining tracery patterns and floral motifs. Finally, we have the Perpendicular Gothic, and this leads and moves well up until the Renaissance in the rest of Europe, from 1350 to 1550. Now, this is going to be a style unique to England, whereby we have soaring walls of rectilinear design and thin vertical supports. The first of these styles to be discussed, with the Lancet Gothic, can be seen here in Lincoln, England, near Manchester. Here we have the Lincoln Cathedral, begun in 1192, illustrating this Lancet Gothic from 1200 to 1250, as one can see the repeated lancet shapes throughout the facade and the spires. The facade, in fact, is broad and shallow, and it is really unrelated to the interior space. What we're attempting to emphasize here with the English Gothic is going to be a broad pull, a horizontal pull of the facade instead of a vertical one. So here, if we compare it to Reims in the cathedral, we can see a solid flat area that is lacking sculptural decoration and is in fact horizontally grounded with the Lincoln Cathedral. Very different from the light, airy, vertical approach that we have here at Reims in France. Looking at the plans, we can also see several differences and departures from the French Gothic style. For instance, the emphatic double transepts with a narrow choir and the addition of a ladies' chapel are all unique to England. Turning to the interior space, we note as well that even though it is bright, it is quite wide and low. The lancet windows give this style its name and can be found throughout, with the pointed arch shape or bullet or conical bullet shape that we have repeated throughout the interior space. The sturdy basilica core, which looks Romanesque, is embellished with Gothic details. Thus we see pointed arches, tracery, moldings, pinnacles, and friezes. There are heavy walls with no flying buttresses. Thus we find that the effect is horizontality, not verticality, as an effect here. Now, the new additions to this structure at Lincoln Cathedral in this new English Gothic included sexpartite vaulting. Now, unlike quadripartite rib vaulting at Chartres and Reims, we find that sexpartite vaulting has, as one would expect, 6 ribs, but now decorated and designed differently. If we look to the ceiling, we can see the so-called crazy vaults, as they are known, in St. Hugh's choir. These are not going to be the same function as in the French example. Now, that being, the French are going to have the ribs supporting the weight of the structure. In this particular instance, if you compare it to Chartres, we can see that there is no logical rhyme or reason, as we have this longitudinal rib, or the ridge rib, running the length of the 4 bays, whereby transverse ribs are replaced by tiercerons, or extensions from the side arches. Thus, they seem to not line up as they do in the French example, moving this way and that quite illogically, as the name would imply, in a crazy fashion. Here we find the ribs themselves do not converge at the central point either. There are 8 irregular segments, in fact, that function as, once again, the rib is denied in this way. It is purely decorative fancy. And that's what the English are going to do with the Gothic, is take something that is structurally sound with the French, its purpose to make it taller, and instead merely make it more aesthetically pleasing and or fantastical. The same can be said of the decorative approach to the choir, with the alternating blind set of arcades that move one on top of the other. Now, the syncopated arcading, as it is called, with these pointed arches flush against the wall with a light-colored column, we have the overlapping with the trefoil arches and black marble shafts. Like blind arcades at Chartres, we have a very English approach to that here. Here we have both the syncopated arches and the crazy vaults, showing us the first departure that we have in the Gothic with the English versus the French. Turning now to southwest of London, we have Salisbury. Here we have a structure made famous by Constable's romantic landscapes at Salisbury Cathedral, a distinctly English type of Gothic.
In architecture as well, we find a deviation from the French style, that courtly style that is being popularized to the south. Here at Salisbury Cathedral, we can see how this new approach in the English Gothic will not emphasize height as much as it does long, broad, strong facades and interior spaces, where we find that screen-like facades are going to be more popular than sculpturally encrusted ones. You must ignore the 400-foot spire here in the center, for it was added in the following century and is in a later Gothic addition. The church at the same time is unmistakably Gothic, with its spires on all sides, its double transept chapter house and apse, all culminating in these designs that are common throughout Europe at the time. But the double transepts and the flat broadness are going to be specifically English. We know that the English even added flanking towers to either side to increase the facade's massive width. And instead of the French rose windows, those circular stained glass components on the nave, we find these are replaced in England by tall lancet or bullet-shaped windows. Comparing the structure to Reims, for instance, we can see a very clear, strong, flat, heavy design that does have some sculptural elements, but not nearly as excessive and as aggressive as what we find in French late Gothic construction. The robust quality, in fact, of this heavy, strong, solid wall is going to be reminiscent of the Romanesque, even going back to the Westwerk that were originally designed by Charlemagne to communicate the power of an abbey or a church that corresponded to the robust strength of the state. The double transepts, in fact, here are more like a monastic church than that of one for the general parish or population. But one cannot mistake this design for anything we have seen recently in France. The emphasis, in fact, is not placed on folding in or doing away with the transept, but instead of emphasizing it, of drawing our attention to it in this instance. As well, the Norman tradition of heavy walls and broadness and the strength and weightiness of a structure is carried on here, instead of the light, open, airy design of French Gothic examples. The horizontal emphasis here draws our attention forward, for instance, instead of and rather than upward, vertically as we see in France. This is going to be reminiscent of the Normanization of England, such as at the Durham Cathedral we saw, which does have the quadripartite rib vaulting that leads to the Gothic, but in heavy, weighty, strong terms, instead of the light, open, airy nature of these Gothic cathedrals at the same time that draw our attention upward, that let in an immense amount of light, that have entire walls covered with stained glass.
Turning now to an even more exaggerated style with the Gothic, we look towards Exeter.
With that being the culmination of the French Gothic, the English had to compete. And as with these regional variations in England and in Germany and in Italy, they adopted aspects of the French International Gothic, but modified it to their own interests so that you knew you were in England and you could not mistake it for a French Gothic work. So here you're going to have Thomas Whitney, an Exeter Cathedral commissioned by Henry III, where he's trying to surpass his brother-in-law, Saint Louis, or Louis IX, the patron of Sainte-Chapelle, with a work that is even more decorative. Hence, of course, the Gothic style in England will develop into the decorated style, as its primary characteristics are going to be overtly decorative, even compared to that in France.
Here we can see three different types of spatial surfaces. First, we have the triangular roof line. Second, the truncated gable with a great window in this decorated style tracery. And finally, much like Lincoln Cathedral, a full screen of sculptures in the front, giving us that heavy, weighty, horizontal feeling. If we look at Salisbury Cathedral in Exeter, we can see here that we have taken this solid, flat front of a facade and then stair-stepped it out into three different divisions. This can be seen more effectively in the stair-step fashion if we look at it from the side, to where we can see the different progressions here. On the interior, this decorated style is an exaggeration of Gothic decoration. In fact, the nave is only 69 feet high, much like a Romanesque structure, but the horizontal pull funneled once again this armature forward. Now, the wrapped lines that we have here are going to continue in nearly every surface. It is overwhelming. There's a rippling effect, much like throwing a stone into a pond, whereby everything is covered in this decorated fashion with an element that is appropriate for this Gothic style. So in the interior, from once again the benches and the seats, up through the decoration, up to the ribs in the ceiling and the bossing, everything is overly ornate. As the vault is, of course, only 69 feet tall, we do have a four-part vault with cross ribs that are appended with tiercerons that have additional ribs for decorative effect. Just like the crazy ribs we talked about a moment ago, these bosses or knob-like elements appear wherever the ribs meet. So here we have tiercerons, which are additional ribs that have no structural support, but are merely there because they are decorative. The bosses, on the other hand, are going to be where those come together, and they are highly ornate. If we show a detail of them, you can see that they even have faces decorated on them. Thus, they have no structural support, but are purely aesthetic. They are purely decorative, which is a distinctly English approach to this style.
Now, if we compare it to what we are intending to compare it to, Sainte-Chapelle, you find that the surface is much more elaborately decorated, and we find that we have multiple overlapping sections even below in the pointed archways and the blind nave arcades, right? So very decorative, moving beyond that of the private chapel.
This decorated Gothic can be seen here in the later version of the Bishop's Throne at Exeter, which is the curvilinear with these flamboyant lines, intertwining tracery patterns and floral motifs. We find that we finally have, in a sculptural sense, what was promised with these delicate pinnacles that spiral vertically in this extremely ornate fashion. We can now see the sculptural ensemble that was promised with cathedrals like Reims in their facade, where we find that it dematerializes, and once again it opens up into the air. The final version of this English Gothic can be seen in the Perpendicular style of 1350 to 1550. Now this is uniquely English. There is nothing like it anywhere else in Europe, whereby we have a rectilinear system of vast walls, windows, and such, with a repetition of cusp panels that are framed in huge grids of vertical lines. This can be seen first in Gloucester Cathedral in the choir from 1332 to 57. Here we have curvilinear bar tracery in the windows that grows literally into the vaults. If we look at the vault, it looks like an intricate spider's web design now, taking the tiercerons and bosses from Exeter Cathedral even further. The designs, if we can see here with the additional tiercerons, these decorative elements are merely going to be appended to other tiercerons that are going to be horizontal and not vertical. This can be seen here in the south cloister in these fan-like patterns that oversee and are in the ceiling. The metamorphosis seen here into fan vaults, as they're called, are sweeping circular ridge ribs with the appearance of giant fans opening up above you. Here we can see the benches off to the side with the appearance of these fans moving up and growing into the ceiling, much like a plant form or a pelagic organism. The fully developed perpendicular style can be seen in King's College Chapel at Cambridge, built between 1446 and 1515. In this example, we can see these fan vaults and a very, very tall vertical interior. And this was the first to apply them to an interior of a nave instead of just a cloister. Now we can see this false construction of a concave series of semi-cones sheathing the ceiling. Now bar tracery is applied with no structural role whatsoever. Looking into the ceiling, it is purely decorative in these elements, much like playing cards, that fan out into these geometric forms. Instead of having a structural support like quadripartite rib vaulting in French Gothic cathedral design, now we can find it as merely decorative. The vault, again, with the intricate spider's web-like design, is going to extend now into a fully fledged decorative element. So here at King's College Chapel, you can see that the elements such as the ribs now give way to something that is entirely decorative, that has nothing to do with anything structural.
This can be seen here with Matthew Paris and his manuscript Illumination, with the self-portrait kneeling before the Virgin and Child, finished in 1259. Here we note that in England as well, universities would come to dominate intellectual life, but monasteries continued to sponsor these active scriptoria, or these workshops where manuscripts would be illuminated or painted. Here we find the monk, or Matthew Paris, is going to be identified in the lower section with his clerical tonsure, dressed in his monk's habit, and written in alternating blue and red lettering with his name, asking for the intervention or a votive on behalf of the Virgin and Child. Now we find that the commentary here is going to, with the linearity, draw our attention to the difference between the English and French Gothic. Comparing it to the Virgin of Jean d'Evreux, for instance, we can see what the English adopted from their French counterparts to the south. The elegant swaying of drapery that moves back and forth. The interest in tonal modulation is going to be kept here, but there is a broadness, a solid flatness to the English version here of Paris's self-portrait with the Virgin and Child that is not found with the French. As well, the bright, agitated, alternating coloring, obviously, and very often complementary colors of green and red, for instance, seen here, carries back to and draws us back to the original Hiberno-Saxon approach that appreciated the millefiore technique and these clearly bounded outlines with bright colors. The linear idiom, right, and the agitated line seen in each one of these is going to attest to this English spirit that still carries on well into the Renaissance and will come to help define their visual artistic style.
In manuscript illumination, we also have examples such as what can be seen here of a Last Judgment, which compartmentalizes a Romanesque tympana, which is often above a Romanesque portal or entryway, whereby Christ is in the center, who is going to be stepping on these dragons, these demons, with the holy elect to either side of him, whereas below, the dead are being raised from their graves and being cast down to hell. So here we find the format for the Last Judgment, common with Gis Libertas and others, with an elongated Christ holding out his hands to separate the saved to our left and the damned to our right. Again, this is also compartmentalized, each section set apart by way of either one that is holy or that is damned. As a detail, you can see here Christ with his hands up with the stigmata, the wound in his hands and his side and his feet, stepping on these red dragons, whereas below him, outside of his oval mandorla, we have winged angels trumpeting the announcement to wake up, to come out of the grave, whereas the holy elect, including the Virgin Mary to our left and St. Paul to our right, are going to be awaiting Christ's judgment. Off to the side, we can see St. Peter and other saints are going to be helping people up with the keys entrusted to them by Christ himself. Below, we can see the angels that are trumpeting and those that are in their sarcophagi waking up with their with the linens they were wrapped in as part of their funerary rituals, coming to be judged. Off to the side, we have Archangel Michael with his sword, assisting in the judgment and the weighing of souls, as we saw earlier with Gislibertus. Here we can see that the illuminator himself is going to be saved by the sword-carrying angel, stating that William de Brawl is going to make me a votive work of salvation. Down below, we have this type of hairy devil who's going to be tormenting souls with a giant mouth below him, eating them. The small bits of red that are going to be coming up representing the fire and the flame and hell as well. Now, with many of these illuminated manuscripts, we often overlook some of the most entertaining aspects, which are known as marginalia. In fact, late medieval marginalia are going to have quite a bit of humor that are employed. They are, of course, funny, but they always are there to affirm the status quo of what is appropriate behavior, what are appropriate roles. And they might do this in sexual ways or showing animals behaving like people and so on. They often will have very entertaining types of scatological humor or excrement, whereby animals might be urinating, defecating, or micturating on one another. So if you look here in Jean Poussel's The Book of Hours of Jean d'Evreux, the marginalia are very common in France as well, and they reinforce these social roles, along with the more common types of secular examples of Jean Poussel, whereby you have knights and maidens interacting with one another and engaging in common activities. We have the more humorous versions mocking the clergy, such as Jean de Montbaston in The Nun Leading a Monk by His Penis, which is illustrated in the Romance of the Rose of 1345. Here we see the warning of an anti-clerical message as a nun leads a monk by his penis and climbs a ladder into her castle. Thus, of course, we have the same type of references again to courtly love. So remember, there are 5 stages of courtship. The first is going to be where one would attract attention for someone you are interested in. The second is body language. You start communicating silently by way of hand gestures or your body. The third is going to be moving on to verbal communication, whereby you actually will say hello or greet the individual you're interested in. Next comes physical touch, usually something simple like a hand on one's shoulder or hand. And then finally, you have sex or consummation in these 5 stages. So in this particular example, we can see that the nun, much like the woman in the casket we looked at Limoges, is going to be leading the man around. And so it just makes it much more obvious in this example what part of his anatomy she is leading him by. And the idea of having a castle as part of her chastity or her womanhood is also going to be quite common. He is literally storming the castle, which is gated surrounding her. So here we find that he is chained by the instrument of his passion. He cannot help himself. And with the 5-stepped ladder, we have the same 5 stages of romance ending in consummation that we just discussed. Now here we have the idea of, quite literally, the medieval punishment for adultery. We find this is quite common, that men who are convicted of adultery will have a string tied around their genitalia with the other end towards or tied to a wild cur or dog, and then they would slap the dog so it would run away and yank the man's genitals. So here we're reinforcing the medieval ideals of courtly love, while at the same time poking fun of monastic celibacy, these people that are told that they cannot engage in congruous and or the type of courtship that others can. Therefore, we find that the later Gothic in France and England is going to find a further development and interest in this vertical architecture that is fully non-mathematical. We also see a greater spiritual transcendence rather than on rational emphasis of these figures that are going to be shown, thus breaking the rules for graceful effect. Next time, we will finish up this class by looking at late medieval art and architecture in Italy and Germany.